My role as Lieutenant Governor is an ambassador for the governor's agenda. Basically, you're a liaison to the cities and towns. You're trying to enact the governor's agenda. I've met with both of the candidates. We're basically all on the same page as Democrats. We're trying to move the ball forward up the field in the state of Massachusetts to bring a more progressive agenda to the state. And my role would be basically to help enact that agenda with the legislature, with the cities and towns as a liaison, and at times, if necessary, or if the governor would prefer, with the media as well. I've been in media for many years as an entertainer in my previous life, and I think I could be beneficial to the party and to the governor. Well, I would say that I've been an entertainer for many years, and I'm in front of the general public, and I'm messaging and communicating a message of, in my case, political satire. In order to understand, be able to do political satire, you have to have a grasp of the issues, and you have to carry the message, and you have to make sense to people who aren't necessarily coming in the door agreeing with you or not. So I think in terms of communications, we really need that. In terms of messaging, we really need that. And the people that I have talked to who have helped supporting me, Bonnie Frank among them, feel that I would be a very good communicator on behalf of the Democratic Party. Not only to reinforce the message to the people who already agree with us, but as importantly, if not more importantly, to get back some of the people we lost. 1 million people in the state voted for Donald Trump. Why? How do we get these people back? How do we communicate our message to the average person in the state, whether they went to Ivy League schools or whether they never graduated from high school? How do we communicate our message, and how are we going to explain to them how we can benefit their lives and improve their state of affairs here in the state of Massachusetts? We're not electing a king. The governor is the spokesperson for an administration. And so it's basically a team effort. An administration is made up of a team. So if the governor were tragically not available to be the governor, if he were to pass away in office or whatever, you rally the troops, you circle the wagons, you get a team effort together, and you proceed with the governor's agenda and the administration's agenda with the team. And you obviously continue what you were trying to do. You work with the legislature, you work with the cities and towns, you work with the general public, you message in terms of why we're doing what we're doing, how it's even more critical now to pass that administration. I mean, if you look at Lyndon Johnson with JFK. JFK tragically killed in the first 1,000 days of his administration. LBJ stepped in. They enacted the greatest domestic agenda, legislative agenda in history since the New Deal, with the Civil Rights Bill and all of the progressive legislation that came out of that. So that's really what you have to do. And it's never really about one person. It seems that way, and this is not just limited to government, but you know, whether it's a company or a football team or a basketball team, there's 11 people on the field in a football team. There's 30 people on the bench. There's, so people step up into their roles. The same with the basketball team, same with any kind of sports analogy or company analogy, or in this case, government analogy. That we improve the state of Massachusetts and the state and the quality of life for the people in this state. That we made government more responsive to them. That we kind of, there's a lot of things that could be improved upon. If you look at just the substance abuse crisis or the reentry reform or just homelessness, there's a series of different shelters and different, programs and different halfway houses and sober houses. And I think that could be consolidated so we get to make a more effective and efficient government. So we have a protocol and a set of best practices moving forward with all of those social issues. And I think if we can provide people with the opportunities that they need to fulfill their potential, especially kids coming out of high school or coming out of college, to fulfill their potential. When I started as an entertainer, in the early 1980s, there was no barrier to entry in terms of doing stand-up comedy. You walked into the club, and this isn't just me, this is Jerry Seinfeld, Roseanne Barr, Chris Rock, anybody who did stand-up comedy in the 80s, and to this day, the barrier to entry is you go into a club, you sign a piece of paper, and you're given the opportunity to do 5 minutes on stage. And that 5 minutes, you can take that and you can continue to develop, and you don't need a degree, you don't need to pay tuition, you don't need to know somebody to do it. It's open to everybody. And I think if we can create this type of opportunities, these type of opportunities for people in the state, regardless of income level, race, class, where they live in the state, geography, I think we would have a much more a happier workforce, a much more productive workforce. And I think people collectively fulfilling their potential in the state is going to bring our state just to another level. And I think that's one of the things I'd like to do, reduce the barrier to entry and give more people more opportunities to fulfill their potential. So if somebody wants to be a roofer or a plumber or an electrician or a filmmaker or a writer or a doctor or a lawyer, the barrier to entry into those professions is reduced. And the same thing with creating better quality public schools. So that becomes more of a reality. So people can take care of themselves. People can do what they want to do. And they bring the passion to their job, their employment. They bring the passion to the workplace. They bring their passion to their fellow workers and their employers. And so I think that would be a great legacy. One of the reasons I got into this is because during the 1980s, I really needed help with alcohol and drugs. And I started calling places for help. And I would get the runaround. There's no beds, there's long lines, call back next week, you don't have insurance. And I called the Cambridge City Hospital, and I said to the person who answered the phone, this is December 1987, I said to the person who answered the phone, I really need help. And without missing a beat, this man said, you called the right place. I went into that hospital, I stayed 7 days through Christmas 1987. I got out, I moved to New York City, I prayed a lot, I focused on stand-up comedy and recovery. A year later, to the week, I went on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. The other guest that night was Bob Hope. So everything I have in my life is directly attributable to that man's response when I reached out for help in December of 1987. And I'm running in large measure for Lieutenant Governor to hopefully ensure that when anybody in the state of Massachusetts reaches out for help, whether it's healthcare, education, housing, immigration, transportation, women's issues, veterans issues, small business, or substance abuse, the answer on the other end always will be, you called the right place. It's largely why I'm doing this, and I really hope I can help. The Fair Share Amendment, which is on the ballot, is going to get a lot of support statewide, the so-called millionaire's tax. And interestingly enough, $2 billion will come into the state earmarked for education and transportation. The irony is that most millionaires would probably support it because they have benefited from the goods and services that are provided in this state with transportation and with an educated workforce. That's how their businesses have grown. And so there was recently a poll, I think it was on WBUR, that said over half support it. And most people who have done well recognize nobody's a self-made person independently of anything else, whether it's family or society or education. No one is. Everybody has depended on somebody. And we're at the point right now that is unequal in the state. It's not fair. It's un-American. And Massachusetts is better than that. And the Fair Share Amendment is a step in the right direction in terms of equalizing the funding, or at least providing more funding. We have to do more. We just can't rely on property taxes to fund local schools, because if you have high quality property, you tend to have higher quality schools, and if you don't have high quality property, you don't have as quality schools, generally speaking. And that's just wrong. Our education potential, we have to allow people to fulfill their educational potential regardless of where they live, what family they were born into, what race, what culture, what part of the state they live in. That's the American way. That's the Massachusetts way. Charter schools In America, people have choices. However, when it comes to taking money out of the public schools for charter schools, I don't support it. I mean, if you have a school district, let's just say, that gets $10 million and a charter school wants to open up someplace, in that district, okay, fine. Just leave the $10 million for that public school system where it is and find additional funding for a charter school or find private funding for it, but don't reduce the amount of money for that school district of $10 million, hypothetically, to fund a charter school. What the state can do is lead the way in terms of building public-private partnerships, creating the housing stock to reduce demand that brings down prices. But also indirectly with that, in terms of housing, is also public transportation. Because when you provide public transportation, you can connect the dots around the state of these different towns. You're going to, obviously, when a station opens up in a neighborhood that doesn't have one, it increases the economic activity, the housing activity, the business activity. People want to live there. It changes everything. I grew up in Cambridge. My brothers both worked on the Red Line extension. They're both union carpenters at the time during the 1980s, when the Red Line was extended from Harvard Square to Davis Square. When that Red Line went into Davis Square, it changed Davis Square. Davis Square, Somerville, was not a destination spot. It was, and by many of the people who grew up in Somerville, nobody was going to Davis Square at night, put it that way. Once the Red Line got there, it just launched a whole host of activity, economic activity and housing opportunities. People moved in there. The Somerville Theater opened up. Red Bones, the great barbecue place. The Burren. I personally had a theater in there for 5 years during the from 2002 to 2007. So as we expand public transportation around the state, housing, people can get to where they want to live. Businesses can move in. There's a whole host of residual effects of that. So it's not unrelated to public transportation, the housing issue. But if the state takes the lead on it, if the state takes the lead in terms of allocating a certain amount of housing, new housing in a particular city or town that's, quote, affordable. Cambridge used to be 10% for many years. It's now, then it went to 15. Now it's 20%. The new rule there is 20% of housing, new housing, has to be, quote, affordable. It's things like that. It can't just be the marketplace. And if we just rely on the market, we're going to have just inequality all over the state, because people are not going to be able to afford to live in certain towns and cities. But the reality also is, especially in the Boston market, not everybody can live in JP, Arlington, Belmont, Cambridge, Somerville. Boston, there's just not enough housing there. So we have to have both government intervention to the extent that it's possible, and also expanding the housing stock around the state, and that comes with expanding public transportation. Income inequality is very complicated, but basically, if you look at the education levels and you look at the investment levels in different cities and towns, and you look at the opportunities that are there for, first of all, high quality public schools, safety, housing, affordable housing, public transportation, this is going to lead more businesses to invest. Businesses want an educated workforce. That's why Massachusetts is doing very well in our state. Basically, we're doing well. We have an educated workforce. To the extent that we continue that and reinvest in education and continue to invest in education, we're going to hopefully close that income inequality gap. But part of the income inequality gap isn't always necessarily just dollars and cents. Sometimes it's opportunity. Just the opportunity to go to a safe, high-quality public school in your own neighborhood. That's huge. To be able to get on public transportation in your own neighborhood, that's huge. Just to have a safe place to live, to work, obviously free of discrimination. All of these things, and to make a concerted effort around those issues. I think these are the biggest things that we have to do. And just in changing the people's attitudes, I think that the country is, personally, I think the country is in much better shape racially in terms of people getting along than sometimes seems, because I think people basically get along. 99% of the people in the country get along and respect one another. Of course, there's still prejudice, and we have to overcome that. And I think that comes out with the basic treating people the way you want to be treated. Getting back to education, I was speaking about earlier. What would you want for your own child? What would you want for your own loved one? What would you want for your granddaughter or your grandson? That's what I'm talking about. And treating people the way you would like to be treated. What kind of a neighborhood would you like to live in? What kind of a job would you like to have? What kind of access to education, affordable housing, public transportation, sports, drama, music, extracurricular activities in schools? What would you want for yourself? And so I think that's the overriding passion that we have to bring back to our state government. I think in the case of Amazon, it's almost a given that all cities and towns do it. They think that that's the biggest issue with Amazon. But the biggest issue with Amazon is not necessarily tax breaks. The biggest issue with Amazon is affordable housing, educated workforce, traffic, congestion, public transportation. How are their 50,000 workers going to get where they're going to live? How are they going to get to work? How long is it going to take them? Do they want to relocate to Boston? Can the Boston market, can the city of Massachusetts, can Massachusetts facilitate these things? Those are as important as tax breaks. I don't think Amazon, with their zillions of dollars, I don't think that the money is the biggest driver of their decision. And this was recently documented in some publications. I think it was in the Globe. Basically saying the same thing, that they're looking at companies, and not just Amazon, but other companies, where they're going to invest. How much is it going to cost for their people to live? How can they get to work? What are the school systems like? Is the population educated? Can they just, can people transition into a job at Amazon coming out of college or high school in the state of Massachusetts? So those things are as important as the tax credits. But I would say that in terms of tax credits, for businesses, let's just say we're talking about Western Mass or the Cape, where they want businesses. We were talking about affordable housing earlier. In Long Meadow or in Uxbridge or in Milford or in the towns in southwestern Mass or Western Mass or Central Mass, Worcester, affordable housing isn't so much the issue. They want businesses to be able to get there. So if we can incentivize businesses and they can sign up and fulfill their obligation, so we have control. So if they say they're going to create 5,000 jobs and they're going to be 10 years, okay, then create 5,000 jobs and be there 10 years. And if you don't do that, then there's a payback to us for that. So we have to hold them accountable in the contracts if we make such contracts. I'm not opposed to it necessarily, but I think that it's not always the overriding issue with some of these places. But in some circumstances, it's going to be. And in some of those poorer communities around the state, if we can incentivize them with tax credits to be there, I say fine, but make sure we hold them accountable and that they fulfill their obligations contractually. I would say we continue on the path that we're going. We need, obviously, wind, solar, technology, and just in terms of recycling, solar panels on public buildings. I was out in West Springfield in the high school there. There were kids in West Springfield who were rallying, they were petitioning their high school to install solar panels. They were spending about $40,000 a month during the winter to heat the high school. And these solar panels, the study was done, and the solar panels would reduce that cost. I mean, that's a huge savings right there. And as the technology improves, if we can have solar panels on public buildings as a matter of our policy moving forward, for the buildings that are conducive to that, not every building is. And of course, the solar, as it improves and it's more effective and it's more cost effective, so it saves money, That's clearly a direction to move in. In terms of wind energy and wind power, of course, we have the offshore wind. We have, we have to be able to create it and situate it in places that are both conducive to the surrounding area, the neighborhoods, the cities and towns that they want it, but also make it as effective as possible. And there's lots of different things. If I may add one thing, it's a little comical, but I used to do a comedy routine about, they were arguing about the Cape Wind. And they said that for 15 years they were arguing about the wind farm off the coast of Cape Cod. And I would make the point on stage as an entertainer. I said, this is America. There's lots of windy places. Do we have to put all the windmills off the coast of Cape Cod? Why can't we put some of the windmills in the breakdown lane on the Mass Pike? I mean, look at all that untapped wind. Now think about this, right, Jordan? Think about this. Using wind generated by cars running on oil to turn little windmills to create electricity to reduce our dependency on oil, right? Obviously, it's satire, but advocating for wind energy. Well, in September, I got an email from a woman in India. She said, Mr. Tingle, I just want to let you know that I saw your comedy routine at the Montreal Comedy Festival about 10 years ago, and your vision for putting windmills in the breakdown lane on the highway is now being implemented by students in India. Clearly, Jordan, I have to run for Lieutenant Governor. I'm a visionary. In terms of women's rights, continue the way we're going in Massachusetts. We're obviously a very progressive state. We've made huge progress in the state. We continue to protect women, and we continue to advocate on behalf of women and families and children. And I think our legislation, one of the things we can do, just like, anybody else in the state, we're continuing with education. We're continuing to have enlightened educators. We're continuing with high quality housing, anti-violence measures, domestic violence, issues like that, stronger controls when those crimes are committed, that women are protected, children are protected. And we continue in the way of legally making, obviously choice is absolute in the Commonwealth, birth control absolute, access to contraception, reproductive rights. It's a given in the state of Massachusetts. We have to obviously continue with that. And if people don't like that, that's fine. Everybody has a choice in Massachusetts. So if people are pro-life, that's fine. If people are pro-choice, that's fine. But in Massachusetts, everybody has got to be treated equally and fairly based on their own conscience and their relationship with their doctors, with their healthcare providers, with their higher power or God, if they have one, or their religious convictions, if they have any. The state can continue those protections and obviously just treat people the way, again, the way we want to be treated. If a gay couple wants to adopt, adoption, child rearing, marriage, it's not based on sex. It's not based on gender. It's based on love. It's based on love. Marriage is based on love. And people are compatible in terms of who they love and their desire to be together. That's a new universal human right. Yes, we're on the cutting edge of it. Yes, there'll be pushbacks, but we're correct on that. And we will be correct on adoption as well. To adopt a child, to love a child that doesn't have a home, and to want to sacrifice to the extent that that is required to adopt, and to the sacrifice that's necessary to raise a child. It's about the hardest thing anybody ever does, and it doesn't pay anything. So anybody is that committed to raising a child that's who should be raising children. People who want them, people who love them, people who are going to nurture them, and again, creating a situation in our state that we're treating people the way we want it to be treated. How would you, and this is really why gay marriage is so accepted here in Massachusetts and so accepted around the country. And really it was people who said, wow, my son's gay, my daughter's gay. Why shouldn't they have a partner? Why shouldn't they have a legal, official marriage for the rest of their lives? Why shouldn't they have children? They're educated, they're hardworking, they're committed, they're moral. Why shouldn't they be allowed to raise children? They would make excellent parents. And it was the parent, a lot of it was, yes, it was the gay community pushing that, but it was also their own parents who was saying, I love my child and I want my child to have the same experience that I had raising a family and being in a committed relationship. So I think that's really what it's about. And I think we just have to stick to our guns, and we can make the moral issue on it, because there is a religious love is a spiritual principle, not just an emotional principle. It's a spiritual principle consistent with all the world's major religions, all the religions. So there is a theological dimension to this that works in our favor in terms of gay marriage. As has been well documented since Parkland, the state of Massachusetts is basically doing a very good job. We have a very low rate of gun violence relative to other states. It did not happen by accident. The Democratic Party has been pushing this, and more enlightened members of the Republican Party have been pushing this for, a generation or two. We need to obviously do more. There's probably some things we can do on a statewide basis that would make it even more unlikely that people would even want guns or have guns in their homes. One of the things I was thinking of is, a passionate statewide gun buyback program. Get these guns out of the home. 65% of the deaths from guns are suicides. And that comes from guns laying around the house. Accidents is another huge issue. Stolen guns is another issue that are used in crimes. So those are some basic things. But when it comes to the gun violence, we have to be vigilant about it. We have to really think about how we're dealing with other states who have much more lax gun laws. I mean, in Chicago, for example, has very high, gun violence in the city of Chicago. Next door in Indiana, Governor Pence, Vice President Pence's state, it's much easier to get a gun. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with states that don't have the same laws, that they can take them across state lines, they can commit crimes. There's a whole black market for it. There's 300 million guns in the country. There's only 350 million people, and there's 300 million guns. I think if we could incentivize people with a gun buyback program, at least to get them out of circulation if people don't need them, that would be a huge step forward. And it would cost some money. And maybe we could use it, do a private-public thing with it. Because and when it comes obviously to assault weapons and things, I don't even think these things need to be on sale. They're military-style weapons. Why does anybody need an Uzi or an AR, whatever it is, AR 50, whatever it is, 15, yeah. Well, I mean, why does somebody need an AK-47, a machine gun in the state? Those aren't hunting rifles. And I think that the NRA and right here in Massachusetts, GOAL, Gun Owners Action League, I think many of these people, many of them, see the wisdom, see the logic, see the pragmatism, the rank and file in terms of background checks, in terms of knowing who has what and for what purposes, not to infringe on hunters, but actually to actually raise the integrity of the hunters, raise the integrity of the members of the NRA who are saying, you know what, we support logical, sane controls so people who should not get these weapons don't get them. And one of the tragedies is not only is it affecting Massachusetts and surrounding states, the other states in this country, South America, Latin America, the drug trade, terrorism. We're the biggest market for weapons in the world for these small arms, and they're going over the border and they're being exported, and it's an economics is driving it largely from the gun manufacturers. They don't necessarily care who's being it, who they're selling to. They're in it for it's a business. And we have to just realize the reality of that and do everything we can in Massachusetts to be an example of what we can do, whether it's with our laws enforcement, with our background checks, with enforcing what's coming in from out of state, what we're selling, how we're selling it, who's allowed to get a weapon here in the state, all of those things. It's not just one thing. And the gun buyback is one dimension. It's not going to solve everything, but I think it would be a step in the right direction. I think you get a lot of public support on it. And yes, it would cost money, but what is the cost of a casket? What is the cost of a funeral? What is the immeasurable cost of the loss of human life to a family? You never get over that. You never get over that, whether it's a suicide, a homicide, an accident. People never get over that. So it's worth the investment of whatever we have to do.